The question of suffering and evil is one of the key questions that many people are asking. In fact, this whole issue is one that has led to many people rejecting the whole idea that there could be a God at all. We just need to look around the world today and we can see numerous instances of suffering, of evil which is happening. We see in the news stories the pictures of earthquakes and the devastation that they cause, and in fact thousands, if not tens of thousands of people which are killed and maimed as a result. Then we have tsunamis. In fact, we can all remember that there have been some very large ones just within the last decade or so that have killed tens of thousands of people, and they just cause enormous destruction. We've got wars, we've got terrorism, something that is on the pages of our newspapers every day. We see it on the television news every night. Unfortunately, there's somewhere in the world where something is happening, in fact not just one place. It seems like many different parts of the world are having massive problems and issues in terms of terrorism, in terms of wars, people dying, people suffering. Closer to home, how many hundreds, if not thousands of people are killed or injured in motor vehicle accidents? This too is a national tragedy. We try to improve roads all the time, but nevertheless, you can't improve all of them. There's not the money to go around. And even on the best roads, there's still going to be human error. And so there are people who die and people who end up in hospital. Then, of course, speaking about hospital themselves, from my perspective as a medical practitioner, I see death and suffering all too often. And I'm sure many of us have been exactly in that position. Many of us are in the healthcare professions. Even those of us who aren't, we still encounter illness, sickness, either with those who are in our immediate family, even ourselves. But close to home, we're continuously seeing this. So there's no question here, look, there's just very few illustrations of the problem of suffering and evil that we have in the world today. And so this is exactly what the atheist looks at and argues and saying, well, look, how could there be such a God when all this stuff occurs? See, the atheist argument is fairly straightforward. First of all, if we take the position that God is all-powerful, and if we say that God is loving, and if indeed then with all of that evil exists, which it surely does, then therefore these things aren't compatible and therefore God does not exist. This has been the atheist's argument actually for many decades. In fact, you could suggest probably going back some centuries. The problem of suffering and evil is a problem that has been a barrier to faith for countless millions over the years. It has been an argument that atheists, that non-believers have used against believers, saying, look, because of all the terrible things that are happening, then the God that you're putting forward just doesn't make sense, and so it seems crazy, but you know what, in all probability, he doesn't exist. Well, how do we deal with that, what seems to be on the surface a pretty powerful challenge to faith? It's an important question and one which we need to deal with. But you know what? It's not a question that only believers have to deal with. See, the problem of suffering and evil is something that every religion and worldview in the world, it's got to deal with it. And I emphasise that again. It's a universal problem, and so every philosophy and every religion in the world needs to somehow grapple with the problem. It isn't just the problem that a believer has to deal with. Yes, a believer needs to come up with an answer to that problem, but the point is that everybody else also has to grapple with the problem. It seems sometimes that it's the believer who's put on the spot, and the believer is the one who has to answer the problem and has to defend God, and the shoe is on one foot. But the point I want to emphasise here is that everybody else must deal with that problem. And what answer do they have to this very important problem? Because that's the question. Unless there's a convincing answer somewhere else, well, why should we actually follow their particular view or belief about it in any case? What I want to do first of all is have a look at atheism. Well, atheism makes this particular criticism, it makes this attack on God. Well, does atheism have an answer to the question of suffering and evil? Well, let's have a look. Let's have a look at what Richard Dawkins says. He says, in nature, the usual selecting agent is direct, stark and simple. It's the Grim Reaper. See, in atheism, there is no problem because that's part of the process. Because what's one of the pillars of atheism? A macroevolutionary view which says what? It says that the fit will survive, and those who are unfit won't survive, they will be consumed in the struggle. And so that suffering and pain is a natural part of the struggle of evolution for the survival of the fittest. So you can see here there's no logical problem, there's nothing to critique. The problem of suffering isn't an issue, it just is what it is. Similarly, when we talk about the issue of evil, now evil is a very interesting one, because how do you define evil? Some have actually used the whole idea, the fact that people argue evil to suggest maybe that in its own way is an argument for the existence of God. Huh? What do I mean by that? That's an interesting one. How can evil be an argument for the existence of God? Well, the idea of evil, and indeed good as being an opposite to it, good and evil, suggests that there's some kind of system of which we can judge what is good and evil. See, otherwise they're just subjective preferences. See, if we have a notion of what is good and evil, what is right and wrong, as we suggested in our very first topic on can an intelligent person believe in God, is that the idea of morality, the idea that we have a notion of good and evil, actually suggests that there is a source of that in terms of us understanding good and evil. See, if we just simply have it as subjective preference, well, that's all it is. And if somebody else has a different notion, if someone else think, well, look, it's quite okay to go and to steal or to kill or to rape or to do whatever they want to do, well, guess what? We might have a notion that this might be evil, but then on what basis can we enforce our understanding on everybody else? See, if we have survival of the fittest, well, it's simply that. It's survival of the fittest. In terms of what is good and evil, well, unless we have an outside source outside of humanity, then it simply becomes that. It becomes subjective preference, and whoever can legislate, who has the power to legislate to the rest of us and tell the rest of us what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what is evil and what is good. Because if it's done within a human context, then it becomes awfully subjective in terms of what is good and evil, and someone's idea may be very different to somebody else's idea. So as you can see, the idea that, within humans we tend to have an intrinsic idea that, look, there are certain things which are evil. Some would argue suggests, well, maybe there is an awareness that there's something which actually is a bit more, and that there is something outside of humanity which provides an objective morality, that being God. But here, we're looking at atheism. So it's very clear what Dawkins is saying. Look, the usual selecting agent is direct, stark and simple. It's the Grim Reaper. Let's have a look at what else, one of the other things Dawkins said. Nature is not cruel, only pitilessly indifferent. This is one of the hardest lessons for humans to learn. We cannot admit that things might be neither good nor evil, neither cruel nor kind, but simply callous, indifferent to all suffering, lacking all purpose. I would suggest it's hardly a philosophy that leads to great hope and optimism in the future. It's basically saying suffering is not an issue. It just is. It's just a fact of life. We just need to accept it, get on with it, I guess be fatalistic to the extent that, we can't do too much about it. That's just the way it is. Lacks all purpose. Well, now the problem is that some of the ideas, and I'm not suggesting by any means that all atheists would have views that are somehow against societal morals. Not suggesting that at all. Some of the most moral people on earth are atheists. I'm not suggesting that. But the issue is that there can be an outworking of an idea of survival of the fittest, which can actually have a practical implication. And there was, I guess, one character that stands out in history of someone who wanted to implement a social form of Darwinism. And some of you will probably immediately guess who one of those people was. Adolf Hitler, and I hear the name. So what are some of the consequences of thinking? Now, this is what Hitler said. He said, look, I freed Germany from the stupid and degrading fallacies of conscience and morality. We will train young people before whom the world will tremble. I want young people capable of violence, imperious, relentless, and cruel. The whole episode of World War II is absolute tragedy. The suffering that happened in Europe, and indeed the rest of the world, as a result of Hitler, as a result of World War II, was immense. There are a number of you here who were alive during that time and you lived through that time. My father lived through that time, and I have heard numerous stories of how terrible that time was. There was immense suffering and evil at that time. But the thing is that when we look at, say, atheism as a philosophy and a worldview, I don't think that we can take a lot of comfort from the ideas of survival of the fittest. I don't think we can take comfort from the idea that it's all just there, suffering is just a natural part of life, and what's more, it just lacks all purpose. So, look, it might be that the atheist makes a particular claim on the Christians and say, well, look, why is there suffering and evil? You explain it, with your idea of God, the challenge is on you. But hang on a minute, I think the atheist also needs to somehow explain, look, is there anything further? Is there anything that we can be optimistic about? Is there anything we can be hopeful about? Is there anything more? And I think on these criteria, I don't think atheism offers a philosophy that gives us a satisfactory, or should I say satisfying answer to the problem of suffering and evil. Well, what about, do other philosophies or religions have the answer? Now, of course, in the short period of time we have this afternoon, we can't run through and talk about all the different philosophies and religions out there. But look, there are many different ideas, anywhere from the idea that good and evil are forces from eternal that keep fighting and grappling each other, and evil just is. It's just part of the natural order of the universe. There are some ideas, some religions who claim that. There are some who claim that, there is a God there, but look, God is just, awfully sovereign. It looks down, and look, we have suffering because, God's view is that, look, that's just the way it is, and we've just got to accept whatever happens to us, that is God's will. So if we have suffering, well, God obviously willed that we suffer, and why us, not someone else? That's not our business to question. That's God's business. Well, okay, there are those views. Look, I'm not particularly satisfied with those. Some of the Eastern religions, they've got a different view as well, and that is that suffering and evil, however we want to label it, comes from the choices we have made in our past life. So the point is, if we've done bad things there, well, we come back, we're reincarnated, and so we need to work through the karma. And so karma being the whole issue of the punishment and process that we have for the way that we have acted in previous lives. Now, does this deal with the problem of suffering and evil? Well, look, there might be some argument that it may help an individual go through continual deaths and rebirths in terms of a purging process, but the implications on society are actually quite negative. There are some parts of the world where these ideas are very strong, where there is a great reluctance to adopt modern medicine. In fact, there's a reluctance to actually intervene and to provide any kind of charity or assistance to another person. And why is that? Because if you do, you're interfering with that person's karma. They need to go through their suffering in order to work through their own processes of purifying themselves and to deal with misdeeds in the past life. And if you intervene, then you are interfering with their karma, and so you're interfering with the processes in the universe. And of course, in some of these religions, the idea, in fact, is that consciousness, the personal identity, is something which is a negative. And what's more, we want to aim for an ultimate where we lose our individuality and become at one absorbed in the cosmic universe. There again, look, with these ideas, we could explore them in a lot more detail, but these are some of the other ideas that are out there. And I've got to confess, to me, they don't provide ultimately a satisfying answer or a solution to the problem of suffering and evil. They don't really talk about the origin of it. Sure, it might talk about some way that we can process it, but ultimately the final solution, I don't think, is ultimately satisfying. And this is where I want to actually run through a Christian answer to the problem of suffering and evil. Because ultimately it's the atheists who put out the challenge. Well, let's accept that challenge. Let's have a look at what it is from a Christian perspective that we can say that actually can deal with this, not only, and look, I guess we can look at it in terms of a logical, philosophical base, and look, that's all, nice and good, but we've got to understand this, and that is that this is actually a personal issue that everyone grapples with. We've all gone through tragedy. The thing is, we actually want to have a solution that sings to our heart, that we can respond to, that actually makes us feel good about ourselves and good about the world and good about the fact that there is something maybe in the future where things are going to be hopeful and even better. The point is, we want to have an answer that not only gives us some logical answers as to why there is suffering and evil, but we actually want an answer that hopefully gives us a solution to the problem and something that we can actually look forward to where things are going to be a whole lot better. Because for many people on this earth, it's pretty bad right now. A lot of people are going through difficulties, suffering, and we've got it pretty good in this country. Although I know that lots of us are going through issues even here. But look, as I travel, there are many parts of the world where it is very difficult. And surely that's a universal longing where we cry out in order to say, well, look, this is terrible. Enough is enough. Isn't there another way? Well, let's have a look at a Christian answer to the problem of suffering and evil. Well, the first thing, and the first principle which I think the Christian scriptures emphasize, is that God is love. That's stated not only directly, but repeatedly through Scripture, that we have a God whose essential nature is love. The next point is that God created humans with the freedom to choose, because love cannot be forced. Now, that's an interesting one, because, look, if you make some sort of robot, look, it might be interesting, but really, is it going to have a genuine relationship with you, and can it love you? Well, no, of course, it can't. But the thing is that the way that we can actually love and reciprocate with love is that we can actually choose. So the whole idea of choice is critical to this. See, if God had created us and we simply had to do whatever was said, and if there was no choice and we couldn't even think for ourselves, it would hardly be a relationship that was based on love. In fact, it would be a relationship that would be very much a servant-master, almost robotic sort of relationship. And that is not what God wanted in terms of his real relationships that he wanted to have with his created beings. So that's why the freedom to choose is so critical. Now, the third one is that freedom meant that humans could make decisions that were against God's wishes and their own best interests. That's, by definition, what freedom is. Freedom is the ability to actually make choices, real choices, and what's that mean? Sometimes you make choices that aren't great. And the problem is sometimes there are choices that you make or can make, and in this case the potential was that people could make choices which were different to what God's ideal for them was. It also meant that they could make choices which weren't in their best interests, and indeed in the best interests of other people. And that's the scary thing. When you've got free will, and if it's a genuine free will, then that free will can be exercised in ways that can go all sorts of different directions with all sorts of consequences. And that's the next point, and that is that evil in the world results from choices that humans have made. Now, we can look at that at several different levels. Christian scriptures speak about an event early in human history. And that is that after humans were created, everything was perfect, but then there was an event where there was what we call in theology the fall. There was separation between God and humans where it actually changed the order or the physical order of the world and the nature of what would happen on earth. And that was twofold. One was in the moral sphere, where there was a separation from God, but also a sinful predisposition, which then ended up happening in humans. And as a result of that, there were people who then, and people after that, were able to, much more easily make choices that were selfish as opposed to loving, choices that actually would harm other people and themselves. And this was something, it's almost like a virus, but it's something that infected the human race, and so there was a tendency towards sin and actions which would be inconsistent with what was God's original plan. So that's on the one hand we have in terms of the moral sphere. But when sin entered the world, or rather there was the fall, it had an impact on the physical world. And so whereas before it was sustained and it worked in a way that was working within, using the word, a perfect environment, there was a degeneration in the physical order. And the book of Genesis does talk about that. There's a term called the curse. And so the world itself started suffering from natural disasters. So things like earthquakes or tsunamis. We can look at the way that the world has operated, and that's why some of these things happen. It's not that God directly jumps in there and makes these things happen. They're not, as insurance companies say, or even some critics will say, well, they're acts of God. No, this is part of the degeneration and the falling apart as a result of a choice that humans made early on. And so we have this idea of sinfulness that has entered the world, and also the fall. So the summary point is, yes, that evil in the world results from choices that humans have made. Not only then how it initiated at the start there, but continuing. What happens? If I decide to exceed the speed limit and I lose control of the car, well, guess what? I can either crash into somebody else or crash into a tree. I could kill myself. I could kill someone else who's in the car, or injure everybody. We could end up in hospital. We could end up with major injuries, which cause us problems for the rest of our lives. If someone decides to steal or to murder, whatever it is that people decide to do, well, the thing is, it has repercussions. Evil results from the choices that people make. Now, the next point is, if God continually intervenes, then he prevents us from truly free action. Now, why is that one significant? Well, some people say, well, hey, why doesn't God just intervene and he just stop it? Look, if he knows that there's evil there, why doesn't he just put a stop to it all? I think it's a good question. Well, the point is this. Let's say that there is an evil intent that somebody has. Let's say someone wants to go out and they've got this plan that they're going to go and murder someone. And God intervenes and he stops them, makes sure that, they can't do what they had chosen to do. Well, I guess that's an extreme example, and look, it'd be wonderful if it happened, but the point is that's immediately interfering with that person's free choice. But what about if it's someone who's stealing? What about if it's someone who's cheating on an exam? What about, and here we could go through many different scenarios of whatabouts, if every time somebody had an intention to go and do something which was evil or would promote suffering in somebody else, if God intervened, ultimately it would lead to a breakdown of the whole system of free will. It would mean ultimately that people, well, whether they could think these things or not think these things, it would totally prohibit them acting through on their free will choices. So it would effectively make people almost robots again, because they wouldn't actually have free choice anymore. And so how then could people respond in a loving way? Now, of course, there are occasions when God does intervene. The scripture talks about them on many occasions where God performed miracles. There are times where people also, these days, report that God has intervened in a supernatural way in their life. There are people who have been healed. There are people who have had amazing answers to prayer. I'm not saying that God doesn't intervene. What is clear that he does. But the problem is, if he continually intervened, we would have a major problem with the whole setup of relationships between humans, between God and humans, because it would interfere with the whole notion of free will. Next point, number 6, is that evil should not stop the quest for relationships based on love. See, God took, didn't he, a major risk when he created human beings with freedom. Because if they made the choice to go against what he was saying, in fact, wanted to do something different which wasn't in their own best interests, it could lead to a whole set of problems. In fact, what we see today. But the interesting thing was, God still went ahead with his creation. He went ahead with a world of humans who ultimately then had that separation, because he thought it was worthwhile, ultimately, for even if that happened, that there be the possible of genuine free will relationships where there would be love demonstrated within the universe. Now, it's interesting here that number 7, God is not able to do things which are not in his nature to do. There are the trivial examples that sometimes you hear, where, is it possible for God to make a weight that is so heavy that he can't lift it? Well, I guess that's a little bit of a logical quandary. People speculate on all sorts of things. But tell me, is it possible for God to lie? No, it's not part of his nature. Is it? And here we could go through a range of moral attributes and say, well, look at these things, the things that are part of God's nature. No, this is important, because if it's against God's nature to do something, then we can't say that he's all powerful. All powerful means you can do every conceivable thing. See, what God is all powerful in terms of his own nature. But God is not all-powerful in that he will not go outside of his nature to do things which are not part of his nature to do. That only makes sense, because that is his very nature. So, be it lying or other things. And this is where it actually leads on, and this is where the whole atheist argument, as a result of this, actually doesn't stack up. It's interesting, the other day I mentioned Alvin Plantinga, the philosopher. He's a Christian philosopher, and he looked at the whole problem of suffering and evil, and he dealt with it from a philosophical point of view. And it was as a result of his published writings in the peer-reviewed literature that the atheists actually changed their focus of attack. He convinced them on the philosophical and logical basis that the previous accusation, the atheist's triad, so to speak, that we looked at the very beginning, is no longer something that can be logically argued, and indeed it doesn't hold weight. So what we can conclude, interestingly, God can be good, he can be all-powerful in the sense that he is all-powerful within his nature, and evil can yet exist. And so that is the answer to the atheist's challenge. So it depends on what we mean by the term all-powerful. It needs to be consistent. Now, God's nature is that he has a loving nature, and so free will is something which is within his nature to do. Now, the 9th point is that God has a plan to deal with the problem of evil. And this is where it's significant. It's one thing to look at the logical and philosophical answers that the Christian faith can have. Look, they might be intellectually satisfying, but the point is it needs to actually work at a personal level, at an emotional level. And that is, it's one thing to explain the problem, it's another thing, what do we do about it? What's God doing about it? Is God interested? Is he disinterested? Where's God in all of this? The point is, God does have a plan to deal with the problem of evil. And what's more, that plan has come at great cost to him. Because we are told that Jesus Christ came to earth, he lived, he died, he suffered crucifixion. And then he was raised from the dead. The point is, just look, that's unfathomable. We saw in the previous session that Jesus is actually the creator of the universe, the creator of the world. He actually made humans. It seems incomprehensible that he would then come to earth and die and be killed by some of his own creation. But it just illustrates the lengths that he went to in order to somehow deal with this problem of sin, the problem of suffering and evil, because he wanted to restore things. He wanted to make it possible that there be a relationship again between God and humans, not just as an academic exercise, just not something which is transient, but something which made a difference for now and for always, forever. I mean, that's just amazing when we unpack that. See, John 3:16 tells it very clearly. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. See, it's not as if God is somehow disinterested. God is intimately interested. He actually wants the best for each one of us. He actually loves each one of us, and he actually wants each one of us to be reconciled with God and to have a future that is eternal with God, where this whole issue is dealt with. And God has made provision for that through Jesus Christ, that we can actually be reconciled. We can actually be a friend of God. We can actually be what's called a child of God. We can be an integral part of his kingdom. I mean, when you look at that, compare that with atheism that says suffering, well, sorry, that's just the natural order of things. No, the Christian view says no, suffering is not part of the natural order of things. It's something which ideally shouldn't be. It's not part of God's plan. In fact, God has a plan, but what the plan is to get rid of suffering, to get rid of evil, to actually reconcile everything together. And this is what we look at in Revelation, a text we've looked at previously, which actually describes what it would be like. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." See, the problem of suffering and evil is a big problem. It's a real problem. No question about that. A major issue that many people have objected to God on that very issue. So the question we've looked at is, how could a loving God allow suffering and evil? Well, guess what? It's not in his plan. That wasn't his desire that this thing happen, but it was a consequence where humans used free will in a way which was a way that they chose, which was different to what God's ideal plan was. And that has led to the fact that there has been the suffering and evil that we have in the world. But, and this is a huge but, I would suggest that if we look at not only atheism, but we look at other philosophies and religions, I would suggest that the Christian answer to the problem of suffering and evil is second to none. That as we look at it, we see that there is a God, our own Creator, who was willing to sacrifice himself so that we all can have the opportunity to be reconciled with him, that this problem of suffering and evil and pain and death can all be sorted, and we look forward to a time where this will be ultimately resolved. The battle between good and evil will be finally won in the favour of good, and we can look forward to a time where there will be an eternity which will be full of positivity and full of love, which ultimately is the quality which God wanted to express through relationships right from the very beginning.